makes it to Russia by the end of 1941. In the summer, we also have the Selective Service Act, which is going to be our first peacetime draft. Now, the ceiling was at 900,000, but FDR asked Congress to repeal that, saying that we cannot speculate on the security of America. Now, this is the summer of 41. The Navy is already authorized to take offensive actions against German ships in the Atlantic. We are already secretively, by this time, sending U.S. Pilots to fight with the British Royal Air Force. And so Americans are already dying secretively. We've already had secret meetings with British officials in Canada, not only to prepare the U.S. to enter the war, but to draw up a plan for how we're going to reconstruct the world after the war. One of the things that we come up with in the summer of 40 and 41 is the United Nations. We're not at war yet, officially, and we're already telling what we're going to do to fix the world once the war comes to an end, which we are not officially in. The draft passes by a vote of 203 to 202. Thus, although we are on the verge of war, most members of Congress do not think, well, I should say 202 out of 203 don't think. In September, the Japanese Prime Minister Fumimura Konoe asked for a meeting with FDR. Secretary Hull says no meeting will take place until the Japanese pull out of China. 1 week later, the Prime Minister asked for another meeting with FDR. Again, Hull says absolutely not. Not until you pull out of China. Meanwhile, German submarines are attacked and thus respond by sinking the U.S. Greer. FDR announces that the U.S. Navy would no longer only offer mere protection, but would go on the offensive, searching for and shooting at elements of the German Navy. Certainly, we are at a naval war in September of 1941, and the House votes to arm all U.S. merchant ships. Germany sinks another U.S. ship, the Kearney, and Congress debates repealing the entire Neutrality Act, which they do on November 1st. Well, is it possible that FDR surrendered the decision to go to war to Japan and Germany? I mean, in September of 41, the U.S. is willing to go to war in all aspects except the actual declaration. November 22nd, Secretary of Hull asked for a 90-day ceasefire in Asia. Japan would end its aggression in Asia in exchange that the U.S. would begin trading with Japan. The Japanese do not immediately reply. On November 26, 1941, Secretary of State Hull sends a 10-point plan to Japan demanding an immediate withdrawal of Japanese troops from China in exchange for U.S. trade and economic assistance to Japan. The Japanese said they will reply point by point. So the 27th, the Japanese respond to the first point. December 6th, 1941, British intelligence report a large convoy of Japanese ships heading to, quote, Thailand or Malaysia. FDR orders the State Department to draft a personal letter sent to the Japanese Emperor Hirohito, calling the situation, quote, a keg of dynamite. At 9 p.m. on December 6th, the message is sent to the U.S. Ambassador Grew, who says, quote, this message means everything. In the early hours of December 7th, 1941, the last Japanese reply to Hull's November 26 10-point plan arrives in Washington, D.C. And this is it. The Japanese government regrets to have to notify hereby the American government that in view of the attitude of the American government, it cannot but consider that it is impossible to reach an agreement through further negotiations. Japan has just declared war on the United States. We already knew this. These messages were sent not through military code, but through diplomatic code. And the U.S. had already broken the Japanese diplomatic code. We knew this was coming several hours before the message was delivered to FDR. So why didn't FDR react? Because he didn't want the Japanese to know that we had broken their code. And, more importantly, the belief was Japan is going to attack the Philippines. That's the big prize. Well, in the Pentagon, General George C. Marshall sends a frantic message to all U.S. Pacific commanders, warning them of an imminent Japanese attack somewhere in the Pacific. Once again, the belief is that it's going to be the Philippines. Shortly thereafter, December 7th, 1941, the Japanese attack the U.S. at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. First, they destroy all of the aircraft at Hickam Field. I used to know American aircraft can chase after them and shoot them down. And then they attacked Battleship Row. Here's the Arizona. The Arizona went down with 1,100 sailors trapped inside. If the fighting was over, the Navy tries to rescue them. We don't have the technology to cut through the hull fast enough. As the hours and days pass, the people on the outside talk to the sailors trapped on the inside through Morse code. After about 72 hours, no more Morse code. So the belief is the last sailors trapped inside the Arizona died about 72 hours later. December 8th, 1941, the U.S. declares war on Japan. Does this mean we're at war with Germany? No. December 11th, 1941, Germany declares war on the U.S. for violating our own Neutrality Act. The Japanese attack on the U.S. at Pearl Harbor finally forced the United States to end its indecision and begin the long and costly struggle to defeat the Axis threat to American security. And some historians wonder, was FDR like Lincoln? In Lincoln's first inaugural address, he says, if there's going to be war, we're not going to initiate it, you will attack us. Is that what FDR is doing? Is he waiting for the U.S. to be attacked in order for the American people to really get behind it? I remember, it was just a few months ago in which the House passes the draft by just one vote. That's Hickam Field on fire in the background. That's Battleship Row up front. You can see the torpedoes splashing in the water. The engines of the Japanese aircraft, which were known as Zeros, was made by a company called Mitsubishi. Doris Miller was the first African American to win the Navy Cross. The Navy Cross was, well, is the second most important medal for heroism in combat. Number one being the Medal of Honor. Doris Miller was born in Waco, Texas in 1919. He enlisted in the Navy in 1939, that there were very limited roles for African Americans at that time. They could work in the kitchen, they could work in the quartermaster. I mean, they can do laundry. So he got a job in the kitchen. Well, he was assigned eventually to the USS West Virginia as the ship's cook. The West Virginia was in Pearl Harbor in Battleship Row. Shortly after serving breakfast, the first of 9 torpedoes will rock the West Virginia. Dory Miller, who's about 6'2", 220 pounds, goes rushing up to the wheelhouse. That's where the commanding officers are. And he removes as many of them as possible, including the captain, the commander of the ship. Well, most of them are surely going to die. The wheelhouse was hit by a bomb. So what he does is he jumps into one of the 50 cal anti-aircraft guns, and he begins firing. He had no training in this, and afterwards, a reporter's going to ask him how he do it, and he said, "Well, it's pretty easy. You just pull the trigger." He fires the 50 cal gun until he runs out of ammunition, and then the Japanese drop not 1, but 2 armor-piercing bombs and 5 more torpedoes on port side, trying to get Miller to stop firing. Well, once he runs out of ammunition, Miller starts throwing wounded sailors off the ship. The ship is going down. All those 5 more torpedoes bring the ship down. And not sure how many lives Miller saved. 2 senators. Now, I'm sorry. The report that came back from Pearl was that a African American sailor did these things. There was no name attached. Well, both the Senate and the House discussed a resolution to give this yet-to-be-named sailor the Medal of Honor. The Secretary of the Navy wanted to give this person the Medal of Honor. Time magazine, eventually his name is going to be published, Doris Miller. There's a typo, and they call him Dory, a nickname that sticks with him for the rest of his life, although it's going to be a short one. Time magazine does an article on him. CBS Radio does a special on this guy. But he's not given the Medal of Honor. He's given the Navy Cross, the number 2 medal. I would say probably race has something to do with that. One thing that you can't do with race is you cannot ignore it. Well, he is sent on a goodwill tour throughout the United States, raising money for the war effort, talking to other African American groups, getting them to enlist. Well, eventually, he's going to be assigned to the USS Liscum Bay. It's an escort ship that finds its way to the South Pacific, and it's involved in a battle. It's sunk by the Japanese. 900 crew. Of the 900, only 272 survived. Doris Miller was declared missing in action. 2 years later, he's declared presumed dead. The U.S. government never finds his body. Here's a shot of the West Virginia. That's what FDR called the attack, a date which will live in infamy. These words, "We here highly resolved that these dead shall not have died in vain." That is an excerpt from Abraham Lincoln's Gettysburg Address. Flag is at half-mast, i.e. there's been deaths, and the flag is torn up. A symbolic attack on Pearl. Remember the Alamo. That was the battle cry in the 1830s. Do you still remember the Alamo today? Remember the Maine? That was the battle cry of the Spanish-American War. Do you still remember the Maine? Do you wake up on December 7th and say, ah, today is a date which will live in infamy? Do you still remember September 11th? Well, here's the reality with memory. People who live through the event remember the event until they die. They pass the stories of the event to their children, who will remember the event because it's important to their parents. If it's important to the parents won't tell them the story once. It'll be over and over and over again. That generation will not pass the stories down. And so by the third generation, by the grandchildren, the people who experienced the event will leave our national collective memory. We do not remember the Alamo. We do not remember the Maine. We do not wake up on December 7th and state, this is a date that will live in infamy. And in the future, not too far down the road, September 11th will be simply another date on the calendar that school children will ask, what's the significance? Just like school children ask, what's the significance of December 7th?